Well, a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Grand Salon for another fantastic conversation. And this evening, talking about the secrets of the city-state in ancient Greece. Please give it up for Alexander Bunzel.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope that you had an opportunity to go aboard and visit Monemvasia. And did anyone have a chance to go to the marina day as well? Yes, the marina was open, and somehow I managed to capsize twice from the same banana boat. I can't understand it. Well, today we are going to be discussing the secrets of the city-state in ancient Greece. And in doing so, I'm going to seek to answer three questions. What was the polis? How did it survive? And lastly, who worked in the polis? Now, the polis quite literally was the city-state. What does this mean? The Greeks regarded the polis as the foundation of their economic development, nothing less. Plato described it as integral to human happiness, while Aristotle perceived it as an association of some persons formed for some good. If these ideas are vague, they attest to the many ways in which cities were believed to improve living standards. And so you see how, then, as of now, people's living standards were at the forefront of a person's mind when deciding the value of something. The polis was certainly a broad concept. It required as few as 4 or 5 people, and these numbers could represent a single household. If anyone's here with their family, you could be a polis. You could be a city-state in its own right, if we look at the raw definition. And that's consistent with the fact that most Greek city-states lacked an urban centre. So clearly the polis was defined less by its scale than its ability to function. And it's hard to know exactly how large some of these cities were, because city-states, like Rhodes, didn't keep statistics to that effect. So what do we know? The polis existed to serve its members, and for that reason, it aspired to manage independently. The philosopher Xenophon reinforces this impression by describing cities as a system of households. In other words, as self-reliant entities. So many of the same understandings that we draw about ourselves and our households and how we operate could be applied more broadly to the city-state. And that really is a good representation, therefore, not only of how these Greek city-states were functioning, but how they thought society should function, much like an individual family. Why did the Greeks orientate themselves around these city-states? Well, I'm going to answer that by going through some of the economic advantages it posed. All major activity took place within the city, where inhabitants lived in close proximity. Even the farmers outside of the city, ladies and gentlemen, were considered to be part of the system. And that's something which reaffirms Aristotle's description of the polis as an association, rather than a terrestrial place. The consolidation of workers in one place was significant, as Xenophon portrayed cities as the most convenient and profitable for commercial business. And in doing so, he shows his economic awareness and the primacy of economic thinking in his deliberations, which is really interesting because the Greeks didn't have a concept of economics like we do today. To understand their economic theory, you have to pore through their political analysis. It wasn't at the forefront, but it was something, inevitably, that underlined how they saw the world. Let's go back to that Xenophon quote. He said that a city offered the best and securest anchorage for vessels in order to prove itself and attract sailors during storms. Now, I find this intriguing because the superlative language, the idea of the polis proving itself, shows the spirit of competition, does it not? It shows the city authorities competing with each other because they understood the role of incentives. They clearly grasped the importance of infrastructure because they were investing money in anchorage. So it's through their behavior that we can draw conclusions about the ways in which the city-states operated. In fact, their encouragement of commercial activity, even on stormy days, illustrates how the city authorities were attentive to people's needs. They recognized the importance of business interests, and they supported the flow of goods. Cities are also interesting to us because they provide a framework for us to understand how the Greeks viewed society. Solon, for example, was an Athenian statesman. He rued how men had become wealthy by trusting to deeds of injustice, saying they steal and rob, and he thought such behavior would destroy a mighty city. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this illustrates the importance of the polis and the impact that its inhabitants were believed to have. In a city containing only a few citizens, of course, each citizen was proportionately more influential. In the same way that in a household with only a few children, every additional actor plays a significant role. Solon's remarks are also interesting because they reflect his belief that economic interactions contain a moral dimension, something which again chimes with our own modern thinking. Perhaps he was considering the impact of greed on the polis, because cities were usually able to solve their own problems. Indeed, Solon is noted for saying that effective laws display all things in good order, lay shackles on the unjust, and check greed. Despite its virtues, the polis clearly required strong governance, and I can tell you from a career in law that Solon's being particularly optimistic about the power of law to control human impulses. So, on that note, what I want to do is turn now to the question of how the polis survived. And in doing so, we're going to begin by looking at the role of the citizens in particular, which brings me to my favorite part of this lecture. Because the Greek citizen class was fascinating in its own right. The polis benefited the citizens by protecting their rights and guaranteeing them income from excess revenue in the public coffers. Citizens were entitled to payment of 2 obols a day each. You might say this is an early case of, what is that policy people talk about today? Thank you, universal basic income. This is why I love working with an educated audience. When I forget something, they remind me of what it is. Yeah, so if ever anyone talks about proposing universal income, please remember this lecture and remember ancient Greece, where it was tried thousands of years ago. But only to the citizen class, the Greek elite. And in addition to receiving obols, 2 obols a day, the citizens enjoyed frequent banquets. So, even in the 4th century, they're living a very fine lifestyle. The money is guaranteeing their welfare, while the banquets were probably enhancing community life. And you'll come to see why that's so important. But for all that we've discussed the citizens, you must remember, ladies and gentlemen, that they were a fraction of the population. These payments were not assisting wider society directly, unless we get into trickle-down economics, but that really is being a modernist. What do these payments do? They raise citizens' expectations, meaning that citizens on hard times were more likely to see internal struggles between the state and the citizens. Also, the citizens were becoming more concerned with retaining their benefits than finding ways to augment their wealth. So when we move on to discuss how the citizens in the main didn't work, or didn't work in the sense that we would understand it, you can understand why. They were receiving these obols, there was no expectation of them, they were only a minority in society, and so other people could do the work. But as I say, these attitudes towards work likely harmed economic development, harming the development of the city-state. And that makes it unsurprising that these Greek societies became dependent upon foreign monarchies following Alexander the Great's conquests. Some cities didn't survive due to unforeseeable disasters. Thera, for example, had a prosperous community until a volcanic eruption midway through the second millennium BC. Once it was rebuilt, its population may have numbered 15,000 citizens, as well as the slaves and regular visitors. Let's turn to the matter of foreign trade. The Greek thinkers recognized that cities needed to participate in foreign trade. Aristotle was pragmatic. He asserted that a city structure was necessary for citizens to live well, while Plato knew it would be almost impossible for the ideal city to manage without imports. So we see an emphasis both on organizing Greek society around a certain fixed structure, but also on that society interacting with other societies, ladies and gentlemen, in order to survive. The word for an independent state financially is autarky, or autarchistic. And autarky was impossible for even an ideal scenario in these philosophers' minds. And that does suggest that all the cities in ancient Greece were interdependent. But that doesn't mean they didn't aspire to self-sufficiency. Plato, for example, understood the advantages of specialization. This is thousands of years before Adam Smith. Plato claimed that a worker excels when performing a single task. He said a farmer would not make his own plough if it is to be a good one. The same is true of the builder. And we can relate to this because while we can cook our own food, we know it's much nicer when Seaborn cooks it for us. So there's definitely this idea of specialization in ancient Greece. Plato was also willing to rely on other people in order to optimize economic performance. Nevertheless, he had reservations towards foreign trade because he wanted cities to be self-sufficient. So what happened in practice? Well, you have places like Thera, which trade with places like Crete, as well as those further away, such as Libya. There was definitely demand for foreign goods and expertise. And those of you who attend my other lecture later this week will hear all about Greek trade, as well as counterfeiting. Evidently, the views of the Greek thinkers that we're discussing today did not align with those of the consumers. Can you imagine the elites being out of touch with ordinary people? Let's turn then to another crucial ingredient in Greek society, immigration. And again, a key way of considering it is to look at what was written about it by the select people. So, Xenophon associated immigration with rising levels of imports, exports, and revenue from rent. And interestingly, this shows us that Greek thinkers sometimes isolated the economic impacts and were thinking about such matters as trade maximization. Again, for people without a clear word for economics, it was clearly a line of inquiry that they explored. Xenophon's confidence in his conclusions may even imply that he undertook an economic study. Now, although he hasn't mentioned any methodology, his results do seem to be calculated, because he's saying that the immigrants are providing revenue, excellent service, are self-supporting, receive no payment, unlike the citizen class. And that does seem like an excellent deal for the polis. The other thing we can do with these kind of lines is read into them. These variables that Xenophon is discussing show us what he valued. They show us what he expected his readers would value. And this is one of the challenges of ancient history. We have so many limited sources to work with that we have to try to analyze them and deduce as much as possible, thinking about what they intended and why they wrote about what they did. Xenophon also criticized the regulations that harmed immigrants without benefiting the city. He evidently recognized these immigrants' value because he wrote about nurturing immigrants like orphans. Maybe that shows the vulnerability he associated with them. And perhaps it implies that the city-state was interceding and playing a parental role to those people who had come from ashore, from further afield. His approach is both paternal and reciprocal. This is not an act of charity, it is something that's being done in exchange for what these immigrants were offering the cities. And in that way, Xenophon's approach reflected an integration of economic and social policy. That's not to say that his opinion was commonplace in Greek society, which is always the risk of reading too much into the views of the literati. In fact, his attempt to propagate this view suggests the contrary, suggests that most people were not as supportive of immigration as he was. Let's look at a different perspective. Unlike Xenophon, Aristotle criticized immigrants. He said they gained citizenship and avoided detection in an overpopulated state. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing has changed in several thousand years as far as the views of these writers were concerned, because we see the same views being put forward by journalists and politicians today. Now, Aristotle's use of the word overpopulated, of course, insinuates that he thinks there should be a ceiling for immigration, perhaps conveying it wasn't a priority for him. You can see then how the different priorities these philosophers had in turn dictated how they perceived the world and what they wanted for their community. But if there's anything that they have in common, Xenophon and Aristotle together represent how Greek attitudes were molded by different objectives, rather than disagreeing about the facts, per se. Let's turn then to the question of who worked in the polis. So the citizens, whom I told you about, tended to avoid labour due to its associations with poverty. And that is so remarkable when you think about how in our society today, labour, and of course importantly leisure, are at the forefront of what we do. And yet the Greek citizens were avoiding it. For Solon's part, he described how the needy man, burdened with the toils of poverty, will acquire much wealth in any way he can. This is the same Solon who I told you about earlier, who was moralizing. The means were clearly irrelevant to Solon. Any work was demoralizing. And Solon's words may in fact remind you of another very famous quotation, often attributed to the Greek thinker Thucydides. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. In this case, the weak were those who worked, as the Greek philosophers saw it. And that quote evokes this duality of power and weakness that seems to permeate the way the other Greek thinkers were looking at the question of labor. But the Greeks didn't disapprove of acts undertaken for personal benefit. So those of you who enjoy gardening would no doubt have been in good company. Plato, for his part, emphasized the need to attend to the things for which wealth exists. The need to attend to the things for which wealth exists. So if you have the wealth, what is it that you're going to do with it? Well, that's not going to count as work in Plato's mind. Clearly, the citizens' lives were not geared towards work because they weren't members of a guild system. They weren't employees of monopolies. This hampered the development of economic activity in the city-state because it made work less relevant to their identities. So, unlike Max Weber's view in the 19th century that there was some Protestant ethic which caused certain Western European countries to develop more rapidly, these people don't have that concept of the calling. They don't have that drive to find their professional purpose in life. But that's not because they're doing nothing, and we're going to come on to what they were doing in turn. You see, Greek society was stratified according to political status, and that created less incentive for the citizens to strive for greater wealth. They're not working because they're thinking, they're volunteering. The polis absorbed them with conversations about civil matters, attendance of assemblies or councils, service as magistrates. Of course, you can think on the job as well as in your spare time, but for them, work wasn't associated with thought. And again, that probably represents how jobs have evolved, because in the modern day, so many more jobs are intellectual, and we would aspire to work in those roles in our spare time. But the work that I've described them doing, the magistrate work and so forth, were engaging. And because they weren't working in the traditional sense, because they were receiving the 2 obols a day, they had a means to pursue these other interests. And again, that contrasts with our society today, where labor and leisure are essentially at the forefront. It wasn't always so. Now, Plato summarized the social situation as a trade-off. He stated that a man who missed an opportunity misses it forever. So the chance to contribute to commerce was the opportunity cost of being a citizen. And as such, Plato believed that anyone who was toiling must be lacking intellectually. Of course, because to his mind, they're missing out on the opportunity to partake in all these interesting discussions. In a culture where acts of labor undermined a person's status, this is perhaps unsurprising. The incentive structure in ancient Greece is one that hindered growth. And neither was there much appetite for change. Aristotle shows this because he advised states to refuse citizenship to workers. So such thinking helped to ensure the ranks remained closed and self-perpetuating. And if we might draw a comparison again to modern society, you can think of how the middle classes were initially deplored by the upper classes, who wouldn't want to share their territory and their space, indeed their status. But there are exceptions. Aegina is an important example. It suffered from infertile soil, and therefore it required its citizens to undertake commerce. So perhaps Greek citizens elsewhere developed an aversion to work partly because they were able to manage without it. And you see here, picture of Aegina, as I've described it, and also there is an image of Solon himself. So let's turn now to the practice of slavery, that which provided the crucial work in Greek society and enabled the citizen class to lead the lifestyle that I've described. Well, the Greek economic model depended on the practice of slavery. The slaves worked while the citizens fulfilled their duties. Hence Aristotle's comment that the household in its perfect form consists of slaves and freemen. He wasn't thinking purely in moralistic terms, but in practical ones, in understanding that for some people to enjoy a certain lifestyle, there had to be others who worked and worked onerously. And that emphasizes the function of slaves, enabling their owners to be free agents in the city-state. How was this possible? Well, the citizens were very few in number, as I've described. And that explains why the slaves were the foundation of their social structure. The Greek thinkers themselves show a range of attitudes towards the practice of slavery. Solon criticized it. He described the city being drawn into base slavery. He wrote of slavery arousing strife among kinsmen and slumbering war, perceiving it to be divisive and immoral. Plato also questioned the enslavement of fellow Greeks, which is a view that was common among his contemporaries. So, even if they're supportive of slavery, seeing their own peers being enslaved was enough to make them challenge their thinking, which might strike you as a double standard, or perhaps it's consistent with their belief that these people in the citizen class and their fellow Greeks generally are different. What is unclear is how far the enslavement of non-Hellenic peoples troubled them. So Aristotle seems to have supported slavery because he found the hierarchy of rulers and slaves necessary, expedient, and fitted for human nature. So we see again this pragmatic thinking in the context of the time that dominates Aristotle's views, as opposed to the moral thinking which shaped the views of someone like Solon. Of course, Aristotle also cited the view that slavery was against nature and unjust, so his support for slavery was ultimately tempered. We've spoken about the role of men in Greek society, be them citizens or slaves, or even traders. Let's focus now on the work of women. Women were not expected to play a significant role in the economy. Even Plato, who argued that the sexes share natural ability equally, did not anticipate women working. Does that mean women didn't work? Not at all. Because Greek literature shows us Penelope working. She was spinning and weaving in the Odyssey. So it seems likely that household work was normal, even if it wasn't something that the citizens liked to discuss. Indeed, in most city-states, the women remained at home, where they could have been working in private a great deal, for all we know. And the work was not always domestic. The historian Chester Starr has claimed that traders and artisans needed their wives to help their professional work, so as to support their families. Were there any efforts to bring women into the workplace in the main? Unfortunately not. Aristophanes in 393 BC explored the idea of female participation in politics. This was in a play called Ecclesiazuria, or Women in Parliament. But he was doing that as a joke, alongside the notion of disenfranchising men and sharing all property. So, we don't see the kind of significant reform, whether to abolishing slavery or to bringing women into the workplace. And yet, for all of that, I have told you about the ways in which the Greek society paralleled our own, whether it be in some of the concerns and prejudices they expressed, similar economic thinking in respect of specialization, money being a symbolic concept, or even in the ways in which they ultimately aspired for independence, but registered the need to be pragmatic and trade. So, to recap, let's discuss what was the polis, how it survived, and who worked there. Well, Greek classical antiquity provided the polis as a foundation for economic life. Within this model, there was a social structure where each tier of people was allotted its own duties as well as rewards. The system was not intended for optimal economic performance. Indeed, it's one that's shaped by political rationales. And yet, economic thought seems to have permeated the city-state as a fact of life and as a means of achieving better outcomes in specific cases such as anchorage and boosting business. And that's why most Greek thinkers accepted immigration and trade, even though they placed greater weight on self-sufficiency when expressing their ideologies. So, the last thought I'll leave you with is that even in a society where economics was secondary to political life, economic forces found ways to emerge in their usual forms. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.